Hello everyone, today we are talking about The Witcher, and I'm going to give my thoughts about the first season, so kind of like a review. I know this is a little late, but I had a really hard time expressing my thoughts about season 1 because I had some mixed feelings about it. First of all, I want to say I really like season 1. As someone who has read the books, it is great to see these stories and characters come to life on screen. For the most part, I think it was casted very well. They nailed all the major characters, Yennefer, Geralt, and Ciri. The fight choreography was great. The Butcher Blaviken fight scene from the first episode was amazing. Gives me a lot of hope for some of the crazier fight scenes to come. The costumes and sets are great. I really like Geralt's garb, and Yennefer and the sorceresses also have great wardrobes as well. The armor set for Nilfgaard and Sintra aren't great, but what can you do? The only thing I would like to see is them take more inspiration from the games with some of the costumes and swords. I think it is a good thing to want to make your own thing and make it your own, but I would like to see Geralt's sword from the games in the show. Right now his silver sword is pretty basic, and the one in the games is really awesome looking. This is a fantasy show. It doesn't have to be the exact sword from the game, but just spruce it up a bit. Be a little bit more creative in this area. Look at Game of Thrones, for example. The swords looked great and they all had really cool names.
Lots of people name their swords.
Lots of cunts.
Look at Jon Snow's sword, Longclaw. It is an iconic sword that most people can recognize, and I think you could do something like that with The Witcher. If I had to give a rating for this season, it would be between an 8.5 and a 9. As someone who knows the world really well, it was very enjoyable to watch, but I'm not like most of the audience. The show felt like it was made for people like me, who read the books and played the games, people who had prior knowledge of The Witcher, which I believe is the main problem of the show. They don't explain things, they just assume people know them. They assume people have prior knowledge. They never really build the world or go into the lore explaining the way things are. The other big problem is the timeline, which I think we all know. I feel like half the comments on my videos talk about the timeline and how confusing it is, which in a way goes back to the first problem, lack of explanation. Now don't get me wrong, I did like how they explained the magic in the series, like when Yennefer was learning at Aretuza how magic has a price. I think they gave enough information on how it works for the audience to somewhat understand it, and then for next season when Ciri is learning it, they can go into further detail with it. Like how mages draw magical energy from the 4 elements, earth, air, wind, and fire. We do see that throughout the season, especially in the last episode when Yennefer drew power from the fire and released it upon the Nilfgaardian forces. They also explain how Witchers are supposed to not have emotions to make them better killers. And this is a big dilemma with Geralt. Can he love? Can he care for things? And he fights with this throughout the first season. But they do glance over some of the more minor details of Witchers, like signs, which are simple spells, and that they carry 2 swords. But we'll get into that later. Let's focus on the timeline for a bit. They do hint at the timelines being different in episode 1, but most people missed it because it's pretty subtle. In episode 1, Ciri is talking with Queen Calanthe and says, "You won your first battle in Huckabutts when you were my age. I've heard the ballad." Ciri is said to be 13 here. Calanthe is maybe in her 50s here. In the same episode, when Renfri is talking to Geralt, she says, "I could have become so many things." Queen Calanthe of Sintra, she just won her first battle at Huckabutts. With this line, they do mention that the timeline is different. That Geralt's story is about 40 years before Ciri's. But most people miss this because if you weren't paying attention, it's literally over in 5 seconds. Also, this is the first episode of the series. It takes people a bit to learn everyone's names, especially in a fantasy series. I remember when I was watching Game of Thrones for the first time. It took at least till season 2 until I started knowing all the characters' names. So unless you were paying extreme attention or had previous knowledge of the series, there was no way you would have picked up on that hint. People wonder why they did it that way. Why would you jump around from different times instead of making it a more linear story? I've read articles saying that the showrunners drew inspiration from Dunkirk, a movie that jumped around in time, but in that movie the different timelines were maybe hours or days apart from each other. In The Witcher, it was decades and years between timelines of Ciri, Geralt, and Yennefer, making it very confusing for people who are new to the series. I've also heard people say it was because it was the only way to show that Yennefer and Geralt don't age the same as normal people, but you could show that in a linear storyline, so that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Some say it was so they could have the big twist in episode 7 revealing that Geralt was at Sintra during the sacking all along and the timeline was different, but I don't think that's the reason either, because by episode 4 we all knew the timelines were different because we saw Queen Calanthe alive, who died in the first episode, suggesting Geralt's storyline was taking place before Ciri's. The main reason why I think they had to do this weird timeline thing is because of the books the first season is based off of. The first two books are The Last Wish and The Sword of Destiny, which are strictly from Geralt's point of view and are compiled of short stories. So none of the stories in the first two books correlate with each other except for the stories that deal with Yennefer and Ciri. So most of the stories in these books are one-offs. They have nothing to do with the next story. As I said before, the books are from Geralt's point of view, so most of Ciri's and Yennefer's POV from the first season were created by the showrunners. In the books, we don't get to see Yennefer become a sorceress. The first we hear of her is when she meets Geralt. Same thing for Ciri, we don't get to see her running around the woods. The reader meets Ciri when Geralt does. This is why the timeline in the show is so messed up, because the showrunners wanted Ciri and Yennefer to be main POV characters throughout season 1. So if they followed the timeline chronologically, Ciri would have been in the last 4 episodes of the show. And originally the show was going to be centered around Ciri, she would have been the main character. But it was switched to the way it is now, but they still wanted Ciri to be a major part of Season 1, so the only way that could happen is if they jumped from different timelines. I would have preferred if they have just gone with a linear timeline. You could have still had Geralt and Yennefer be the main POV characters for the first half of the season, and then introduce Ciri after the marriage of her parents, Duny and Pavetta. This means Ciri would have less screen time than she does now, but for the most part we just see Ciri running around the woods. Probably could have cut some of that out. Maybe supplant that with more of Yennefer's story. For example, her time at the school. You could show her improvements or get deeper into the magical lore, or you could have shown Yennefer's time at court at Aden. Shown why she was unhappy with it. We never get to even see her there, they completely jump over it. I think that would have made the season a lot less confusing for people who are new to it. Now don't get me wrong, I'm glad they made Ciri and Yen POV characters. We got to learn a lot of their backstory, which I really enjoyed. But the way they set it up is where the issues arise with the timeline. The other big problem is the lack of explanation on things in the show, specifically on Witchers. I think why they were vague on these topics is because next season Ciri will be learning all this stuff, so they didn't want to repeat the same information twice, but they at least could have given some explanation on some of the things and give some lore here and there. For example, with Witchers, they never explained some basic things that all Witchers use and have. They never really mention that Witchers carry 2 swords, one being silver for monsters and one being steel used for humans and animals. Jaskier does mention it once in the series the first time he meets Geralt, saying, "Oh fun, white hair, big old loner, 2 very, very scary looking swords. I know who you are, you're the Witcher, Geralt of Rivia." But this doesn't really explain why he carries 2 swords. I think they could have explained it in the first episode. Marlika is somewhat of a young girl here. You could have had her ask Geralt, "Why do you carry 2 swords on your back?" And Geralt could have told her. Now, I know this is somewhat obvious, but you get what I mean. Something like that. In the Harry Potter franchises, they do this all the time, right? Harry is new to the wizarding world, and he has a lot of questions that get answered by other characters. They even do this in the new Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them movies. With the Muggle Jacob, he is new to the world like Harry was, and Newt explains what's going on, which in turn explains it to the audience. They could have used Jaskier in a similar way here for at least some things, like signs for example, which are spells. that Witchers can cast. We see them in the first episode with no explanation. By the way, there is 5 different spells or signs Witchers can cast: Ard, Igni, Yurden, Quen, and Axii. Once again, Yennefer does mention this in the season very briefly the first time she speaks with Geralt, saying, "What little spells can you cast with your hands? Call it professional curiosity." And that's it. We see Geralt use signs throughout the episodes, like in episode 3 when he's fighting the Striga, and in episode 6 when Geralt and Yennefer are protecting the dragon egg. But we don't learn much more about them than that. So someone new to the series sees that and they think, oh, Witchers can do spells like mages. But in reality, those spells are very simple compared to what a mage can do. And once again, I think Ciri will be learning all this stuff next season. And that's kind of the reason why they didn't want to put all that this season, because they just don't want to repeat themselves, which is understandable. And that's really it for some of the problems. There's a lot more, but I think those are the major ones I had. So what do you guys think? Leave it down in the comments below, and if you want more Witcher content, please subscribe and check out the Twitter, link in the description below, and as always, have an awesome day.